We all know the instructions of Paul to Timothy when he tells Timothy that he needs to entrust the word to faithful men who will be able to then teach others. I have the privilege this evening of introducing Jacob Sanford, who is one of those faithful men who has decided at a very young age to give his life to the Lord and to teaching the Lord's word. He is originally from Oklahoma. His family's in Kansas City, and he's studying in Bear Valley. And we have the privilege as the Linder congregation of helping him financially during the 2 years he will have been there when he finishes in May of next year. I had some time with Jacob last night, and I can tell you he's, as I said to someone this morning, he's a good soul. That's an elderly expression, but he's a good soul. This man loves the Lord. This man wants to serve the Lord. This young man has a lot of faith. And this young man is excited about learning what the will of God is and about sharing it with other people. I asked him what he intended to do when he was through, and he's thinking about missions, thinking about possibly youth ministry, but maybe there will be some other way in which he can serve. At any rate, whatever Jacob decides to do, he'll be teaching and preaching the word the rest of his life. Jacob, it's up to you.
I don't know if you've seen somebody shot by a taser, but they shake. I'm kind of nervous and they're shaking. Maybe as much as a taser. Before I jump into the sermon, in August, I think I got somebody. I think John was talking about LTC this morning. I got these letters from. I don't know if it was all girls, but I think it was mostly girls. These LTC letters, very encouraging. And I tack up on the wall all my supporters' cards that get sent to me. And so that's where your cards are at. They're up on my wall. And one of them I'm not going to cite because I'm a visiting preacher, but one of them was kind of funny. It made me laugh. But it's a little borderline, but it was good. So thank you for that. That was very thoughtful. A while back, I was talking to a friend about this awesome passage of Scripture. And it talked about God and how he acted towards this Old Testament prophet. And the specific incident was Elijah and how God acted with Elijah on this mountain. And the conversation that my friend and I were having was about topics that do not get preached on very often. And she mentioned the topic of selfishness as something that doesn't get preached on very often. And I was thinking, I don't know when the last time is I've heard a lesson on selfishness. And so I thought that was true. But the one I noted, she had selfishness. The topic I noted that I didn't think I've ever heard a sermon on is gentleness, God's gentleness. And so tonight, that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at how God was gentle towards one of his people, specifically Elijah in the Old Testament. And from this passage of Scripture, kind of the big point that we're going to try to take with us and expand and talk about is that God treats his people gently. It's very simple. It's something we may know, but just not something we think about probably enough. And we're going to look at it kind of two sides of the coin, or twofold. We're going to look at how God treats his people gently when they want to give up. And then we're going to look at how God treats his people gently when they don't want to start again. And we see that in the life of Elijah. But first, let's look at how God treats his people gently when they want to give up. If you want to go ahead and go to 1 Kings, we're going to be in chapter 18 and chapter 19. And just the specific incident that we're looking at, or account, or story, is I'm going to try to kind of give like a brief overview. We're going to run real quick from beginning to end, and then we're going to go back and look at some verses and just kind of some points. So it begins, we're looking at that famous scene where Elijah's on top of this mountain, and he challenges prophets of Baal. And to like fire comes down and consumes offerings. That's kind of the context. At the beginning, Elijah he's been gone for a while, and he is found, and King Ahab is this wicked king in the northern part of Israel. And Elijah comes up to him and confronts him, basically, and says, can you gather all of Israel and prophets of Asherah and prophets of Baal? And then the story progresses, and basically we have like a contest between the prophets of Baal and Elijah. And the contest is to see whose God will answer, pretty much, is what the contest is. And so from morning to evening, at this contest, the prophets of Baal, they call out to their God. And they're like cutting themselves and doing all this, but they do not get an answer from Baal. Elijah does something, and they have to like cut up this oxen and put it on wood and try to get fire to come down from heaven. And the prophets of Baal did not get a response. So Elijah takes his oxen, puts the wood underneath it, and then he pours water on it. And then he digs a trench around it and pours water into the trench. And that would make it harder for it to flame up or to catch fire. And Elijah prays to God that he will answer him. And he even says, answer me, God. And God sends down fire from heaven, and it consumes everything, even the stones, even a stone. Fire consumed the stone. And so God answered Elijah, and showing that, that side was the winning side. That was the God that responded. That was the God with the power. And all the people there, and all the people are there, and they see that. And it has an impact on them. It has an impression on them. And they even acknowledge that God is God, basically. And then we have this story kind of progresses, and the land's been in a drought, and Elijah helps in bringing rain back to the land. And if we back up for just a second, after God responds in fire, we see Elijah tells the people, seize the prophets of Baal. And he goes and slaughters the prophets of Baal. He kills them, and they're trying to wipe out kind of evil from the land. And wicked King Ahab, so he's the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, he goes back to tell the queen, his wife, Jezebel, who was a very wicked woman, about what Elijah had done. And she basically says to Elijah, she sends him a message saying, you're going to be dead by this time tomorrow. And one thing we're going to try to focus on is kind of the big emotional roller coaster between Elijah having success and then having someone tell him that they want to murder him, they want to kill him. And Elijah ends up, he's afraid, and he runs for his life from Jezebel. So just kind of just putting into your mind this story, this is kind of where we're going to be living at as we look at some different things. And then Elijah has this awesome experience with God on this mountain. And so that's kind of the story, just a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at. But in the next few minutes, try to picture with me Elijah, and you're picturing his mindset. And so picture like a roller coaster or like a tube or a stream of thinking. And Elijah has this certain stream of thinking that he's trying to accomplish. He's trying to get his people to turn back to God because they haven't been there. We're going to look at a couple verses here and try to try to see how Elijah was thinking, how he was on this upward progression of a roller coaster. Because ultimately what Elijah was wanting, he was a man who was all in it for God, and he was trying to bring about revival. So if you look at chapter 18, verse 19, Elijah says, now then send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. So when we think, why would Elijah call all Israel to, this scene? And he's talking to the king, and it's because Elijah has in mind something later on down the road. So we're going to see how Elijah is trying to bring the people, and he's really thinking big, and he wants to make an impact. And he wants the people to see something. He wants them to see the true God. And then if you jump down to verse 39 of chapter 18, actually verse 36, it says, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that these people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again. So there we see Elijah saying, like for him, he's not just trying to prove like these prophets of Baal wrong and say that, their God is false, but it's to accomplish like this national overhaul. He's saying, bring all of the people here. He's praying to God, please help them to turn their hearts back to you. And that's what he's attempting to do. If we look at verses 38 through 40, it shows kind of God's response to Elijah's prayer. It says, Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, The Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. Then Elijah said to them, Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape. So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slew them there. So if we revisit like this roller coaster, so we had verse 19. He's getting all the people there. He wants them to see something, and then it keeps going up. He wants them, he's praying to God, please turn these people's hearts back to you. And then he's taken and he's killed all these prophets of Baal. And so you see this roller coaster where in Elijah's mind, he's probably thinking, this is a turning point. And this is his thinking. So just kind of keep that in mind with that being his thinking. And then verses 41 through 46 is kind of put in there. It describes how Elijah's bringing rain back to Israel. And he tells Ahab to go ahead, and he basically tells him to go ahead and boogie because there's a heavy shower coming. And then if you look down in chapter 19 and verse 1, this is where the roller coaster is going up, and then it suddenly falls. So this story is very, it's all about kind of Elijah's emotional upheaval. So he has this mindset where he's thinking that things are starting to turn around. And then in verse 19, or chapter 19, everything kind of turns for the worst. So in 19, verse 1, it says, Now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, So may the gods do to me and even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. So she wants to kill him, and he was afraid. So, we can imagine Elijah on this roller coaster. So he's going up, and he's trying to turn the people back to God, trying to show them who God really is. And then, in a short period of time, someone is telling him that they're seeking to kill him, seeking to murder him. So you can just imagine the emotional change that had to put on him. And Elijah, he ends up running from the northern tip. Basically, Mount Carmel is kind of in the northern tip of Israel. And then he runs basically to the southern tip. He runs as far away from Jezebel as he possibly can. And then a little bit more. If we look, and if we continue reading in verse 3 and down to verse 4, we see Elijah's emotion. So in verse 3 it says, And he was afraid and arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die and said, It is enough now, O Lord. Take my life, for I am not better than my fathers. So Elijah is sitting here and he's saying, nothing really matters anymore. I just want to die. Because the train of thought he was on, his dreams and his thoughts got shattered. And now he's saying, people are trying to kill me. Just take my life now. And if we think about Elijah, and we try to put it into context, you have a prophet. He goes and challenges the most powerful man in Israel, the king, or you could argue that Jezebel maybe was more powerful, but he challenges this wicked king. And not only that, but he tries to initiate all of this change in the nation. And so he's going up against the government a lot. And he seems to be making headway. He seems to be making, getting towards a turning point. But then it flips, and kind of the bottom of the story falls out on him. And instead of the people coming back to God, it seems like the status quo hasn't changed. The wicked rulers are still in power, and people are coming after him. If you look at verses 5 through 8 of chapter 19, again, our big topic is gentleness. God treating his people gently when they want to give up. And Elijah has given up at this point. And if you look at verse 5, it says, he laid down and slept under a juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said to him, arise and eat, arise, eat. So when Elijah gives up, how does God treat him? How does he handle him? Well, God sends him someone. God sends an angel to him. Verse 6 says, then he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. So God gives him some fuel to keep going because he needs it at the state that he's in. And also at the end of verse 6, it talks about rest. God gives Elijah some rest. He's in emotional shock. And he's like, I'm going to send you someone. I'm going to give you the fuel that you need to keep going. And I'm going to let you rest as well. And then verse 7 says, the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. So we see God treating him gently there. He didn't show up to Elijah, and Elijah wanted to give up and quit. And he didn't show up and say, hey, I need you to go do this task. When Elijah's saying, he's sitting there wanting to die, God doesn't show up and say, okay, I need you to go do this thing now. Or he doesn't show up and say, and reprimand him and say, what are you doing here? Why are you here? With that motive behind it, to discipline him. God takes care of him. He treats him very gently. So that's kind of the first fold of this. The first side of the coin is God treats his people gently when they want to give up. Just like Elijah here wanted to give up and did give up, and God treated him gently. But the other side of the coin is that God treats his people gently when they don't want to start again. So you have Elijah, he's going, he quits, and then Elijah's still in that state where there's no activity, there's no energy, so he's still kind of down in the dumps. But God treats him gently still so that he can get him started again. And so God treats his people gently when they don't want to start again. If you look at verse 9 of chapter 19, so this is 1 Kings 19:9, we see Elijah in a cave. So he gets up and he makes this journey, but then he's in a cave. It says, then he came there to a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And verse 11 says, God, so he said, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by. So we see God, there's four things. There's this mountain-breaking rock. There's an earthquake. There is fire. And then finally we get to a gentle whisper or a gentle wind. But Elijah is sitting here, and these things, actually, let's go ahead and read about them. In verse 11, continuing on, it says, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? So notice, though, that it says God was not found in, that rock-breaking wind. He was not found in the earthquake. He was not found in the fire. That could be maybe something that preceded him, and it symbolizes God's power or his wrath or his bigness, how he's bigger than all. But Elijah hears a voice when the sound of a gentle blowing comes. I was practicing this, and at this point in my practice, I wanted to change it up a little bit. So at this point, you're thinking, I'm boring, and this guy is more of a teacher than a preacher. That's okay, I get it. Also, you might be looking at me. My mom told me one time I need to start lifting weights because I have the body of a 12-year-old. So maybe I'm kind of small. But this story is so emotionally charged, and maybe I'm not the best person to bring it out. But so that's number one. My best friend back in Denver, he told me one time, when you read the Bible, you have to read in between the lines. And so for a second, let's read in between the lines. In verse 9, Elijah goes off into this cave. He kind of snuggles himself up, and he's in that cave. And notice that God doesn't yank him out of the cave. Really, God lets Elijah make the movement. And so maybe you can imagine like a wind blowing outside of that tunnel, that gentle wind, and it draws Elijah out. So God allows Elijah to make his own movement, out of his emotional shock. And if you look at verse 14, I think, can we picture Elijah? God asked him the question, what are you doing here, Elijah? I think we have to read verse 14. Elijah had to be sobbing. He had to be in tears. Because, can you imagine having your friends killed by the sword? Can you imagine that environment? And God just asked him a question. He says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And then I have to think that Elijah, crying, answers, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And, God allowed him to move towards that gentle whisper or that gentle wind. And so, a question we could ask ourselves, each individually, is, do I ever think about God's presence in my life as being a gentle wind, as being a gentle whisper? I remember like some cartoon movies. Do you remember cartoon movies where there'd be like a gust of wind come up on a road, and they would make sure you knew it was wind because there would be leaves and like that stream of wind, and there was like some white lines. Do we ever picture God being with us as like a stream of wind that wraps around our body and wraps around our head, and we have leaves, wrapping around us? Because we might say, God is always with me, but do we think about how God is not only with us, but he's very gentle with us in his presence? And God gives Elijah a purpose, and he gives him a new framework of thinking after he appears to him in this gentle wind, this gentle whisper. If you look on down at verse 15, God kind of gives him this purpose. He says, the Lord said to him, go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Maholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place. It shall come about, the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death. So Elisha's sitting here, and he's like, I want to die. And God's saying, you're still my man. I still have purpose for you. You need to go anoint two kings. You need to go anoint the person that's taking your place. And so that gives him purpose once again. And then we see that God gives Elijah kind of this new framework of thinking. In verse 18 it says, God's telling Elijah, yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. So Elijah, he had been thinking actually everything correct. Like this was his stream of thinking, and it was all correct except for one thing. He thought he was the only one. But God treats him super gently by saying, okay, your stream of thinking is going this way, and I'm just going to gently pick you up and set you right here and take your stream of thinking this way. And it's very gentle. how God just corrects him in a very small way, but he gives him this new framework of thinking. So he gives him purpose, and he gives him a new way to think. And so he kind of picks him back up. Here for a second, I'm going to try to be a storyteller. So we'll see how it goes. But for a second, just picture this. Just picture this concept in modern day events or modern day terms. So maybe picture just for a second like a man in his mid to late 40s. He's a good man. He's a godly man. And he has a family. He has 5 kids. And he has a wife that stays at home. She tries to instill principles in her kids that they'll later on live and teach them about God. And our main character, this man, he recently has a job promotion to a new division in the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And everything in this family's life is going well at this point in time. And this picture that we're painting. But if you fast forward 6 months down the road, Congress announces new budget cuts that eliminate this division of the EPA, and it eliminates this man's job. And so the man drives to work the next morning like any other day, and he learns the news that his job is gone, that it's been cut. And so he drives home in shock. And he eventually gets home and he tells his wife the news, and he kind of ends there crying in her arms. And everything at this point has been turned upside down. But if we enter into the story, a gentle God, we see that things change. That night, the man's wife helps him into bed because he's still in so much emotional shock that at this point it would just be best for him to get some rest. And as he sleeps, she prays for him. And then the next day, the man staggers out of bed a little bit later than normal. Still kind of in that emotional shock. His wife she's cooked him breakfast so she could spend time with him, so she could see how he's doing and look out for him. And then over the course of the next 3 weeks, the man starts really spiritually digging as a way to deal with this unemployment, as a way to deal with this emotional upheaval. He reaches out to his church family to ask them to pray for him. He begins praying more than he ever has, and he starts reading his Bible. And during the whole time of this unemployment, the man feels an unusual sense of peace and comfort. And then 4 months later, so you go 4 months later down the road, an old friend comes to town. And this old friend reaches out to the man who is unemployed, and he knows about his situation. And he hears about what his family is going through. And they get together, and eventually this old friend offers this man a job in a environmental affairs division of a local attorney's business. And this man accepts the job, and his family once again have what they need. We just kind of pictured that, but a lot of people go through circumstances like that. That is something that's not too far off from what is reality for a lot of people. But can we see a gentle God in stories like that? Can we see God protecting that man mentally and emotionally? Can we see God protecting his mind, hedging in his mind, and saying, I'm not going to let you go off the deep end in your thinking. I'm not going to let your thinking go to dark places. I'm here with you. Can we see God being gentle by using that man's wife as a tool in the hands of God, as a vessel to work through? When she cared for him, when she just kept him going, when she picked him up. Can we see God being gentle by patiently hearing that man's prayers when he was going through that unemployment? Can we see God being gentle by speaking to that man through his word? Maybe he would read stories like this, and God would tell him things like, I am not going to leave you. I am here to encourage you. I'm with you in this. And then maybe the man's prayers would be stuff like, honestly, I feel like I'm going to fail. I feel like our family has no future. We feel hopeless. And God's on the other side saying, I hear everything that you're saying, and I'm intimately involved in your situation. And actually, I'm more intimately involved in this situation than even you are yourself. You know, can we see God, all of that, the whole ball of wax, can we see the gentleness of God in that? Where he's kind of patting his people and telling them that they're not going to fail, that he's going to be with them. But maybe you're here today and you're in that state where your emotions have been turned upside down, kind of like Elijah. We can all remember that we have a God who cares for us, who wants to calm us and comfort us. We have, the people here, the church, the people can be a tool God uses to show his gentleness. The people of God can be God's hug, can be God's watery eyes, can be God's smile. God can work through his people and show his gentleness in that way. But if you're here today and you're just struggling with something emotionally, there's good people, people that want to help you continue on. But if you have any need for prayers, or if you've been thinking about getting baptized, you never hear someone give it all to God and look back and say, I regret doing that. So if you have any need tonight, you can make that known if you want to come to the front while we stand and while we sing.